They had been warned. Told in hushed whispers and shouted commands alike that if they were ever captured, death would be a mercy compared to what awaited them. The stories circulated through the ranks like a virus. Allied soldiers, they were told, would parade them through streets while angry mobs threw stones and spat. They would be chained like animals, dragged through towns as trophies of war, humiliated before jeering crowds who had lost sons and brothers to German bullets. Some heard that prisoners were forced to crawl on their hands and knees through city centers while children kicked them. Others were told they would be beaten unconscious before being displayed in town squares like conquered beasts. Before we jump back in, tell us where you are tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you are subscribed because tomorrow, I have saved something extra special for you. For Klaus Zimmermann, a 23-year-old infantryman from Bavaria, these images haunted his dreams more than the actual combat. He had survived the hell of Monte Cassino in Italy, watched friends disappear into smoke and fire, felt the earth shake beneath him as artillery turned the world into a nightmare. But it was the thought of capture that truly terrified him. Not the moment of surrender itself, but what came after. The humiliation. The chains. The faces twisted in hatred as townspeople took their revenge on defenseless men who could no longer fight back. Werner Koch, a panzer crewman from the Rhineland, carried a different fear. He had heard from a returning officer who had been briefly held before escaping that American guards forced prisoners to strip naked and march through main streets while photographers captured their shame for newspapers back home. The officer claimed he had seen it with his own eyes in North Africa. Men reduced to nothing, their dignity stripped away along with their uniforms, paraded like cattle before slaughter. Werner swore to himself that if it came to that, he would find a way to die with honor instead. The propaganda machine fed these terrors with systematic precision. Radio broadcasts detailed fabricated atrocities. Newspapers printed artist renditions of Allied brutality that bore no resemblance to reality but seared themselves into the minds of young soldiers far from home. Officers reinforced the message during briefings. Surrender was not an option. Capture meant degradation worse than death. Better to fall on the battlefield with a weapon in hand than to face what the enemy had planned for those they took alive. By the spring of 1944, as the Allied advance pressed deeper into Europe and the situation grew increasingly desperate for German forces, these fears intensified. Men who had once believed in swift victory now faced the grinding reality of retreat and collapse. The question was no longer if they might be captured, but when. And with that inevitability came a deepening dread about what awaited them on the other side of surrender. Hans Berger, a machine gunner from Saxony, remembered the exact moment his unit realized they were surrounded near the French town of Saint-Lô in July 1944. The American forces had broken through their lines with overwhelming firepower. Tanks rolled forward like iron waves. Artillery pounded their positions into rubble. And then came the infantry, methodical and relentless. His commanding officer, a hardened veteran of the Eastern Front, gathered the remaining men and gave them a choice. Fight to the last man or surrender. The officer made clear his preference. He would not surrender. He would not give the Americans the satisfaction of parading him through their towns in chains. But Hans was tired. Bone tired. Soul tired. He had been fighting for 3 years. He had seen enough death to fill 1,000 lifetimes. And as he looked at the faces of the other young men around him, boys really, some barely 18, he wondered if dying for a war already lost made any sense at all. When the white flag went up, raised by a young corporal whose hands shook so violently he could barely hold the cloth, Hans felt a strange mixture of relief and absolute terror. The dying was over. But now came something potentially worse. The American soldiers approached with weapons raised, eyes hard and cautious. These were not the soft, pampered troops German propaganda had promised. They moved with the confidence of men who had fought and won countless battles. They were dusty, tired, and clearly in no mood for games. Hans raised his hands higher, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst through his chest. This was the moment. This was when the chains would come out. When the beating would start. When he would be dragged before cameras and mobs. Instead, an American sergeant, a stocky man with a thick New York accent that Hans could barely understand, shouted at them to line up. No chains appeared. The Germans were searched quickly, efficiently. Weapons were confiscated. Watches were examined but mostly returned. One soldier had a photograph of his wife taken from his pocket, looked at briefly, then handed back with a curt nod. Hans waited for the blow that never came. For the rope or chain that never materialized. Water was passed around. Hans stared at the canteen offered to him as if it were a mirage. The American soldier, seeing his hesitation, made a drinking motion and pushed the canteen into his hands. Hans drank, the warm metallic water, the most precious thing he had ever tasted, not because it was particularly good, but because it represented something he had not expected. Humanity from the enemy. The march began within the hour. German prisoners, nearly 200 of them, were formed into columns and told to walk. No chains bound their hands. No ropes linked them together like enslaved people. Guards walked alongside them, rifles ready but not pointed directly at anyone. Hans kept waiting for the other shoe to drop. This had to be temporary. Once they reached a town, any town, the real treatment would begin. They walked for hours through the French countryside. The summer sun beat down mercilessly. Some men stumbled from exhaustion and wounds. American medics moved through the column, offering water and, in some cases, bandaging injuries right there on the road. Werner Koch, marching near the front, could not process what he was seeing. These were the same men who had been killing his comrades hours before. Now they were wrapping bandages around a German soldier's bleeding arm with the same care they would show their own wounded. As evening approached, the column entered a small French village. Hans felt his stomach clench. This was it. The moment every nightmare had prepared him. The villagers would be there, waiting with stones and hatred. The Americans would step aside and let the mob have their revenge. He had seen what German forces had done in occupied territories. He knew the anger that must be simmering in these French towns. And now, defenseless and defeated, he would face that fury. The village appeared around a bend in the road. Stone buildings lined narrow streets. A church steeple rose against the darkening sky. And there, emerging from doorways and gathering along the road, were the civilians. French men and women, old and young, coming to see the German prisoners being marched through their town. Hans braced himself. He saw an old woman step forward and his entire body tensed. This was the moment. She would spit. She would throw something. She would scream at them. Instead, she simply stared, her face unreadable. A young boy pointed at the prisoners, and his mother pulled him back, not with anger but with a protective instinct, as if she wanted to shield her child from the sight of defeated men. The American guards maintained their positions around the column. They did not step aside. They did not invite the villagers to approach. They simply kept the prisoners moving through the town at a steady pace. No chains rattled. No one was struck. No one was pulled from the line to be made an example. As they passed through the village center, Hans saw an American officer speaking with the local mayor. The conversation was brief, professional. The mayor nodded, and the officer rejoined the column. Whatever exchange had occurred, it had not involved handing over prisoners for public punishment. On the far side of the village, the column halted at an open field. Here they would spend the night, the Americans explained through interpreters. Rations were distributed. Hard biscuits and canned meat. The same food, Hans later learned, that the American soldiers themselves ate. Guards established a perimeter, but within that space, the prisoners were allowed to sit, to rest, to speak quietly among themselves. Werner found Hans in the growing darkness and sat down beside him. They said nothing for a long moment, both trying to make sense of what had not happened. Finally, Werner spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "Where are the chains?" It was not really a question. It was an expression of disbelief so profound that words could barely contain it. Hans had no answer. He simply shook his head and stared at his hands, still unbound, still free to move as he wished within the confines of the guarded field. Everything they had been told was wrong. Every story, every warning, every terrifying image that had kept him awake at night was a lie. And if that was a lie, what else had they been lied to about? The next morning brought more of the same impossible reality. After a breakfast of coffee and bread, the prisoners were formed up again and told they would be marching to a larger collection point. Once again, no chains appeared. The guards were alert but not cruel. The pace was steady but not punishing. And when they passed through another town, this one larger than the first, the same pattern repeated. Civilians watched from windows and doorways. Some faces showed anger, yes, but it was a controlled anger, held in check by something. By law perhaps, or by the presence of the American soldiers who made clear that the prisoners were under their protection. No mob formed. No stones flew. The Germans walked through the streets of enemy territory unchained, and nothing happened except the steady march of boots on cobblestones. By the third day, Hans began to accept that this was not a temporary mercy. This was policy. This was how the Americans operated. They did not chain their prisoners. They did not parade them for public humiliation. They marched them with a strange mixture of firmness and respect that defied everything Hans had been conditioned to expect. In a town called Corentin, something happened that would stay with Hans for the rest of his life. The column had stopped briefly to allow the men to rest. They sat along a stone wall near the town center while guards distributed water. A young French girl, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, approached slowly from across the street. Her mother called after her, alarmed, but the girl kept coming. An American sergeant moved to intercept her, not roughly but clearly intending to keep her away from the prisoners. The girl said something in French that Hans could not understand, but her tone was not aggressive. She held something in her hands. The sergeant looked down at what she carried, then at her face, then back at the object. He seemed to be making a decision. Finally, he nodded and let her pass. The girl walked directly to the nearest German soldier, a young man from Hamburg who had been wounded in the leg and walked with a pronounced limp. She held out what she carried, a small loaf of bread, clearly from her own family's meager supplies. The German soldier stared at her, completely frozen, unable to process this act of kindness from someone who had every reason to hate him. The girl set the bread in his lap when he did not take it, said something soft in French, then turned and ran back to her mother. The American sergeant watched the whole exchange without interfering, then simply told the prisoners it was time to move again. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The German soldier from Hamburg carried that bread for 2 more days, unable to eat it, unable to throw it away, unable to understand it. These were the moments that broke through the propaganda like hammers through glass. Not grand speeches or political arguments, but simple human gestures that revealed a truth the German soldiers had never been allowed to see. The enemy was not the monster they had been promised. The chains they had feared did not exist. And walking through American-controlled towns under guard felt nothing like the nightmare scenarios that had haunted their darkest imaginings. As the prisoners were loaded onto trucks that would take them to a larger POW camp, Hans looked back at the towns they had passed through. He had walked through enemy territory, defeated and disarmed, and he had not been chained. He had not been beaten. He had not been paraded as a trophy. He had been marched as a soldier who had lost a battle, with a dignity he had never expected to be granted. The realization was staggering and deeply unsettling. If they had been lied to about this, what else was a lie? What else about the enemy, about the war, about everything they had been told was propaganda rather than truth? These questions would haunt Hans and thousands like him in the months and years to come. But in that moment, bouncing along a French road in the back of an American truck, all he could think about was the absence of chains and what that absence meant about the world he thought he knew. The larger POW camp sat just outside a town called Cherbourg, hastily constructed but surprisingly organized. Rows of tents stretched across a field, with wooden barracks being erected even as new prisoners arrived daily. Hans and the others from his capture group were processed through a system that seemed impossibly bureaucratic for a war zone. Names were recorded. Personal information documented. Identification tags issued. Each step reinforced the bizarre reality that they were not being treated as nameless captives but as individuals whose identities mattered. What happened next shattered even more of their preconceptions. Within days of arriving at the camp, guards began organizing work details. Prisoners who were healthy enough would be taken into nearby towns to help with reconstruction efforts, to clear rubble from streets damaged in the fighting, to assist with tasks that required manual labor. The announcement sent waves of anxiety through the camp. This was it, many thought. This was when the real treatment would begin. They would be taken into towns, forced to work like slaves, chained together as they labored under the hostile eyes of civilians who wanted them dead. The morning the first work detail was assembled, Werner found himself among those selected. He had barely slept the night before, his mind racing through scenarios of what awaited them. As they lined up for inspection, he looked down at his wrists, bare and unchained, and wondered how long that would last. Surely once they were in town, exposed to the public, the Americans would need to restrain them. Otherwise, how would they maintain control? How would they prevent the civilians from attacking? The American sergeant in charge of the detail was a man named Patterson, a former construction foreman from Pennsylvania who spoke with a rough directness that left no room for confusion. Through an interpreter, he explained the day's work. They would be clearing debris from a street that had been partially destroyed during the liberation battle. They would be given tools. They would work alongside American engineers. And they would be under guard at all times, but not chained unless someone gave reason to be restrained. Werner exchanged glances with the man beside him, a former artillery officer named Friedrich who had maintained his composure better than most since capture. Friedrich's face showed the same disbelief Werner felt. Tools? Working alongside Americans? Still no chains? It made no tactical sense. How could they maintain security without physical restraints? The trucks rolled into Cherbourg just after dawn. The town bore the scars of recent combat. Buildings stood with walls missing, exposing intimate rooms to the sky like dollhouses. Rubble filled intersections. Shattered glass crunched under boots. But already, life was returning. Shops were reopening. People moved through streets, beginning the long process of rebuilding. And into this fragile renewal came trucks full of German prisoners. The vehicles stopped on a street corner where a partially collapsed building needed to be cleared. American engineers were already on site, surveying the damage and planning the demolition. As the prisoners climbed down from the trucks, Werner saw civilians stopping to stare. A woman with a shopping basket froze on the sidewalk. An elderly man leaning on a cane turned to watch. A group of children playing in a nearby courtyard ceased their game to gape at the enemy soldiers now standing in their neighborhood. Werner's heart hammered. This was the moment. The civilians would rush forward. The Americans would step back and let nature take its course. Justice would be served by those who had suffered under occupation. He braced himself, muscles tense, ready for the first blow. Instead, Sergeant Patterson barked orders in English, and the guards formed a loose perimeter around the work area. Not a tight circle meant to protect the prisoners from a mob, but a practical boundary that kept the work zone clear. The civilians watched but did not approach. The guards watched the civilians but did not raise their weapons in anticipation of violence. Everything remained calm, professional, almost mundane. Tools were distributed. Shovels, picks, wheelbarrows. Werner stared at the shovel placed in his hands. It was heavy, real, a tool that could easily be a weapon. Yet no one seemed concerned about arming prisoners with implements that could crack skulls. The American engineers began directing the work, pointing at sections of rubble that needed to be cleared first, explaining through interpreters the safest way to approach the unstable structure. And then, something extraordinary happened. An American soldier, a young private who could not have been more than 20, stepped into the rubble alongside the German prisoners and began working. He picked up chunks of broken masonry and heaved them into a wheelbarrow. He wiped sweat from his forehead and grinned at the German beside him, making a comment about the heat that needed no translation. The message was clear. This was work, not punishment. They were laborers, not slaves on display. Werner began to work, his movements mechanical at first, his mind still struggling to process this reality. Around him, other prisoners did the same. They filled wheelbarrows with debris. They carefully dismantled sections of wall that threatened to collapse. They followed instructions given by American engineers who treated them like members of a work crew rather than conquered enemies. The morning sun climbed higher. The work continued. And slowly, gradually, the civilians who had been watching began to lose interest. They returned to their own tasks, their own attempts to rebuild lives shattered by war. The German prisoners became just another part of the landscape of reconstruction, no more remarkable than the rubble they were clearing. During a water break around mid-morning, Werner found himself standing near the edge of the work zone, gulping down water from his canteen. An American guard stood nearby, rifle slung over his shoulder in a casual manner that suggested he was not particularly worried about this thirsty prisoner. The guard pulled out a pack of cigarettes, lit one, and then, almost as an afterthought, offered the pack to Werner. Werner stared at the offering. Cigarettes were currency, comfort, a luxury that had become increasingly rare as the war ground on. And here was an enemy soldier offering them freely. He took one with a hesitant hand, and the American guard lit it for him with his own lighter. They stood there for a moment, two soldiers from opposite sides of a war, smoking together in a ruined French street while neither wore chains and neither seemed inclined toward violence. The guard said something in English that Werner did not understand, but the tone was conversational, almost friendly. Werner nodded, having no idea what he was agreeing to, and the guard chuckled before moving on to check the perimeter. Werner drew on the cigarette and felt something fundamental shift inside him. This was not tolerance of prisoners for strategic purposes. This was not even mercy in any formal sense. This was just two tired men sharing a smoke break, and the casual normalcy of it was more disorienting than any interrogation could have been. By noon, local civilians had begun to interact more directly with the work detail. A woman from a nearby house brought out a pitcher of water and cups, offering refreshment to the workers. Sergeant Patterson accepted on behalf of everyone, prisoners included, and distributed the water without distinction between American soldiers and German captives. The woman watched this with an expression Werner could not quite read, a mixture of sadness and something else, perhaps a resigned acceptance that the war was over and life had to continue. An old man approached later, addressing one of the American officers in halting English. The interpreter translated. The man wanted to know if the prisoners could help clear debris from his shop, which was 3 buildings down from the current work site. The officer considered, consulted with Patterson, and agreed. The work detail would expand its scope. The old man nodded gratefully and shuffled away, not once looking at the German prisoners with hatred or fear, but simply as laborers who might help him reclaim his livelihood. This pragmatic acceptance proved more powerful than any propaganda speech could have been. These French civilians who had lived under German occupation, who had every reason to demand vengeance, were instead focused on rebuilding. And if German prisoners could contribute to that rebuilding, then so be it. The message was clear. The war was over. Life continued. Hatred was a luxury no one could afford when there was so much work to be done. Friedrich, working beside Werner as they cleared rubble from the old man's shop, spoke quietly in German. This is not what they told us would happen. It was a simple statement, but it carried the weight of everything they had experienced since capture. Werner only nodded, lacking words adequate to express the cognitive dissonance they all felt. The work detail returned to camp that evening exhausted but unharmed. No one had been chained. No one had been beaten. No one had been spat upon or stoned. They had worked in a French town, in full view of civilians who had suffered under German occupation, and they had been treated as workers. Nothing more, nothing less. The realization spread through the camp that night as men shared their experiences. The pattern was consistent. Work details went into towns, worked alongside American soldiers, interacted with civilians, and returned unchained and unmolested. Over the following weeks, this routine became normalized. Different prisoners rotated through work details. Some cleared rubble, others helped repair roads or worked on construction projects. In each case, the experience was the same. Guards maintained security but did not use chains. Civilians watched but rarely interfered. The prisoners remained visible, present in towns and villages, yet the predicted violence never materialized. Hans participated in a work detail that took him into a small Norman village to help repair a damaged bridge. The project required several days of labor, and the prisoners were brought to the site each morning and returned to camp each evening. On the third day, a local farmer approached during the lunch break. He carried a basket of apples, somewhat bruised but precious nonetheless given the food shortages throughout France. Through an interpreter, the farmer explained that his orchard had survived the fighting, and he had more apples than he could use before they spoiled. Would the workers like some? The American sergeant accepted, and the apples were distributed. Hans bit into his apple, the sweet tartness exploding in his mouth, and watched the farmer trudge back to his cart. The man had not asked whether they were American or German. He had simply seen workers and offered food. The simplicity of the gesture cut deeper than any complexity could have. As summer turned to autumn in 1944, thousands of German prisoners passed through French towns under American guard. Some were being transferred to larger camps. Others were on work details. Still others were being moved to ports for eventual transport to camps in England or the United States. In every case, they walked or rode through populated areas, visible to civilians, and in every case, they remained unchained. The psychological impact of this reality cannot be overstated. These men had been conditioned to expect the worst. They had been told that capture meant degradation, that the enemy was barbaric, that chains and humiliation awaited anyone who surrendered. Instead, they found themselves walking through enemy towns with a dignity they had never anticipated. The absence of chains became a symbol of something larger, a fundamental difference in how the two sides conducted war. Werner would later recall a moment in late September when his work detail was marching through a town whose name he never learned. They passed a school just as children were being dismissed for the day. The kids poured out into the street, laughing and shouting as children do, and then fell silent as they saw the column of German prisoners. The guards tensed slightly, alert for any trouble, but the schoolteacher who emerged behind the children simply guided them to the side of the road and told them to let the soldiers pass. As the prisoners walked by, one small boy, perhaps 6 years old, waved. It was an instinctive gesture, the kind of innocent action children make before they fully understand the complexities of the world. His teacher quickly pulled his hand down and whispered something in his ear. But the damage, if it could be called that, was done. Werner had seen the wave. Had registered it as a human connection that transcended the categories of enemy and ally, prisoner and free. He did not wave back, could not have even if he wanted to given the circumstances, but the boy's simple gesture stayed with him. These accumulating experiences began to work on the prisoners' minds in ways that direct propaganda never could. They were seeing with their own eyes that the world was not as they had been told. The enemy did not behave as predicted. The chains did not exist. The humiliation was absent. And in the space created by that absence, doubts began to grow about everything else they had been taught. Klaus Zimmermann, who had survived Monte Cassino and feared capture more than death, found himself on a work detail in October helping to prepare a warehouse for winter storage of supplies. The building was in a town large enough to have a main street with shops and a small cafe that had recently reopened. During the midday break, the prisoners sat on the warehouse loading dock, eating their rations while civilians moved about their business on the street. A young woman walked past pushing a baby carriage. She glanced at the prisoners, her expression unreadable, and continued on her way. Klaus watched her until she turned a corner and disappeared. In that moment, he was struck by how ordinary it all was. Here he sat, a German soldier and prisoner of war, eating lunch on a loading dock in a French town while life continued around him. No chains bound him. No mob threatened him. He was simply there, a defeated enemy soldier being allowed to exist in the same space as the people he had been fighting against. That evening, back in camp, Klaus tried to write a letter home. The Americans allowed prisoners to send mail, though it was censored and limited. He struggled to find words that would pass the censors but still convey the truth of his experience. Finally, he wrote simply, "I am well. The Americans treat us fairly. Do not worry about me." It was inadequate to express the profound shift in his understanding, but it was all he could safely say. Throughout the autumn of 1944, as Allied forces pushed deeper into Germany and the war's outcome became increasingly clear, the stream of German prisoners grew into a flood. The Americans processed thousands, then tens of thousands. And in each case, the policy remained consistent. Prisoners were secured but not chained. They were guarded but not degraded. They were visible in towns and villages, working on necessary tasks, passing through on their way to camps, and the predicted violence from civilians never materialized on any significant scale. This mass experience created a collective realization among German prisoners. They compared notes, shared stories, confirmed with each other that what they were experiencing was real and consistent. The Americans genuinely did not chain their prisoners when moving them through towns. It was policy, not accident. It was deliberate, not an oversight. And that deliberateness suggested a fundamental difference in worldview that many prisoners were only beginning to comprehend. Friedrich, the artillery officer, was eventually selected for an officer's interrogation camp. As he was being transferred, his truck convoy passed through multiple towns over 2 days. At each stop, he observed the same pattern. Guards maintained security through vigilance and positioning, not through physical restraint of the prisoners. Civilians observed but did not attack. The machinery of war continued to function, but without the casual cruelty he had expected based on everything he had been taught. In a moment of reflection during that journey, Friedrich realized that the absence of chains was not a sign of weakness or naivety on the Americans' part. It was a sign of confidence. They did not need chains because their system worked without them. They had the resources, the organization, and the discipline to maintain control through other means. And in doing so, they preserved something that chains would have destroyed, the basic human dignity of their prisoners. Whether that was intentional or simply a byproduct of their methods, Friedrich could not say. But the effect was undeniable. As winter approached and the first snow began to fall on the camps of northern France, the German prisoners who had walked through American-controlled towns unchained carried with them a knowledge that would shape the rest of their lives. They had seen the enemy's face up close, not in the heat of battle but in the mundane reality of occupation and reconstruction. And that face looked nothing like what they had been promised it would look like. The chains they had feared existed only in propaganda, not in reality. And that single truth opened the door to questioning everything else they thought they knew about the war, the enemy, and the world they would eventually return to. Up next, you have got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you will not want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.